Jack the Ripper, the mysterious serial killer whose identity has long remained a mystery.
That is.
Until now.
Yeah, DNA from a shawl recovered at the scene of one of his crimes has incredibly found a 100% match.
Hundreds of suspects have been named for this case, and it has baffled investigators and ripperologists alike for over 100 years.
For 137 years, the name Jack the Ripper haunted police files and history books, yet no one could uncover the face behind the murders that terrified London.
How many H.H. Holmes actually murdered? Just as there is a fascination with serial killing in our society.
Now, new evidence has done what generations could not. Jack the Ripper's true identity has finally been revealed. And the truth is more disturbing than anyone imagined.
Jack the Ripper, perhaps the most infamous serial killer of all time.
The Autumn of Terror begins. On the cold and quiet morning of the 31st of August, 1888, a shocking discovery was made in Bucks Row, a narrow street in the Whitechapel district of East London. The body of Marianne Nichols, who was often called Polly by those who knew her, was found lying near a stable yard.
When Marianne Nichols' body was found, at first it looked like a simple murder.
When the police and a local doctor arrived, they were horrified by what they saw. Polly's throat had been deeply cut, and her abdomen had been violently slashed. The wounds were not the result of a simple attack.
Her skirts were up as though she was committing an act of prostitution at the time she was killed.
They appeared deliberate and skillfully done, as though the person responsible had some understanding of anatomy and knew exactly where to cut. This made the crime seem even more disturbing, because it suggested the killer might not be an ordinary criminal acting out of rage, but someone who planned carefully and acted with purpose. Polly Nichols had lived a hard and difficult life. Like many women in the East End, she struggled to find steady work and often had nowhere permanent to stay.
These women were living very much a day-to-day existence, not necessarily knowing where they were going to sleep that night.
Poverty in Whitechapel was severe, and many people lived day-to-day with little food or security. Women who were alone or homeless were especially vulnerable, and they often walked the streets at night in search of shelter or a small amount of money. When news of Polly's murder spread through the neighborhood, people were both shocked and frightened. The women who shared her circumstances felt that what happened to her could easily happen to them. Only 6 days later, on the morning of the 8th of September 1888, the fear in the East End deepened when another woman, Annie Chapman, was found murdered in a yard behind 29 Hanbury Street, only a short distance from where Polly Nichols had died.
Annie Chapman's wounds were very similar to Polly Nichols, but much more severe.
Annie's body had been mutilated in a way that was even more shocking than the first crime. Her throat had been cut in a similar fashion. But what most disturbed the police and doctors was that parts of her body had been carefully removed.
The throat was cut deep to the spine again. The intestines were thrown over the shoulder, and the uterus was missing.
When the medical examiner studied the wounds, he remarked that the organs had been taken out with a level of precision that could not easily be done by someone without skill or knowledge. This led to serious discussions among the police and medical experts about whether the killer might have some form of surgical training. The press quickly learned about the murders, and newspapers across London began reporting on them in great detail. The more they wrote, the more anxious the public became. Reporters described the scenes in plain but vivid language, and the stories spread rapidly through every part of the city.
And found that crowds were gathering there to discuss the murder, the murderer's motive, and who the murderer might have been.
Each new article made people more aware of the danger that seemed to be growing in the East End. For the residents of Whitechapel, the fear was personal. The narrow streets, the crowded lodging houses, and the dark corners where people gathered now felt unsafe. Women who once walked home alone at night began to stay indoors. Friends and neighbors traveled together whenever possible, and people spoke in whispers about what was happening. Everyone wondered who might be next. What had begun as a pair of brutal killings was now the beginning of a fear that would spread far beyond Whitechapel, when letters claiming to come from the killer began to reach the press and police. Letters and a name born in ink. On the 27th of September, 1888, something arrived at the offices of the Central News Agency that would change the way people thought about the Whitechapel murders forever. It was a letter addressed simply to Dear Boss.
The Boss letter is interesting because it is the first letter apparently having been written by Jack the Ripper.
The writer of this letter mocked the police and boasted about the killings that had already taken place. The tone of the message was confident, almost playful, as if the person behind it was enjoying the fear that had spread through London. Towards the end of the letter, the writer warned that more murders would follow and then signed off with a name that no one had ever seen before. The signature read, Jack the Ripper. The letter was written in red ink, which made it even more striking. Some believed the ink was meant to suggest blood. When the newspapers received copies of it, they immediately saw how powerful and shocking it was. They printed the letter in full, reproducing the red ink signature so that every reader could see it. Within days, the name Jack the Ripper was being spoken everywhere in London. It was simple, memorable, and frightening. For the public, the name turned the mysterious killer into a recognizable figure, one who seemed both real and larger than life.
The name was a work of genius. The press would be proclaiming the most famous name in criminal history.
A few days later, on the 1st of October 1888, another message arrived, this time in the form of a postcard. It began with the words, Saucy Jackie, and it mentioned 2 new murders that had just taken place on the same night. These killings came to be known as the double event. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride, who was attacked and killed on Berners Street in the early hours of the 30th of September. Her throat had been cut, but it seemed that the killer had been interrupted before he could carry out further mutilation. Less than an hour later, another woman, Catherine Eddowes, was found dead in Mitre Square. Her injuries were far worse. Her face had been disfigured, and one of her kidneys had been removed.
Both had their throats slashed, and both had abdominal wounds with their viscera removed.
When the Saucy Jackie postcard referred to both murders, it caught everyone's attention. The fact that the writer seemed to know details that were not yet widely known made people think the same person who wrote the postcard might have actually committed the crimes. The timing was too close to be ignored. Many in the police force were deeply unsettled by this possibility. It meant that the killer might not only be committing these murders, but also sending letters to taunt those who were trying to stop him.
And in that letter, there were 2 details that matched the murders.
The horror deepened further on the 16th of October when George Lusk, who was the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received another package. The Vigilance Committee was a group of local residents who had come together to help the police because they were frustrated by how slow the investigation seemed. Inside the small parcel sent to Lusk was a letter and a small box. The letter began with the words, From Hell.
We demand something be done, and done tonight.
From hell.
When the box was opened, it was found to contain half of a human kidney, which appeared to have been preserved in alcohol. The message claimed that the kidney belonged to one of the Ripper's victims. Doctors examined the organ, and some believed it could indeed have come from Catherine Eddowes, who was known to have had one kidney removed during her murder. Others were not convinced, suggesting that the letter and the organ might have been the cruel work of a hoaxer seeking attention.
There really is nothing to prove that this letter was written by the murderer himself.
Despite the doubts, the public was horrified. By this time, the letters had become as much a part of the story as the murders themselves. Even though many police officials and medical experts suspected that the correspondence might not have been written by the real murderer, the tone and timing of the letters had an enormous effect. The name Jack the Ripper was now permanently attached to the crimes.
And asked him if he was familiar with a Dr. D in connection with the Jack the Ripper murders.
The murders no longer seemed to belong only to the poor streets of Whitechapel. They had become a national obsession. The newspapers played a major role in this transformation. Competing for readers, they printed every rumor, every new theory, and every word that came through the mail.
The radical newspapers who used the murders really to have a go, basically, at the police.
Each headline added more fear. People across Britain followed the case as if it were unfolding in front of them. What had once been a local tragedy now felt like a story that belonged to everyone. The fear of the unknown killer had become part of everyday life, and the name Jack the Ripper had become one of the most famous names in the world. With the press driving events, the police investigation expanded rapidly, marking one of the earliest large-scale manhunts in modern history. The manhunt and its limits. The Metropolitan Police soon realized that catching Jack the Ripper would be no ordinary task. They assigned over 80 detectives to the case, gathering some of the most skilled and experienced officers in London. Among them were Inspector Frederick Aberline, Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, and Detective Inspector Edmund Reed. These men walked the dark, narrow streets of the East End for hours on end, braving foul smells, cramped alleyways, and the constant fear of danger. They visited overcrowded lodging houses, questioned nervous residents, and tracked down anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. Each day brought exhaustion, frustration, and the knowledge that the killer could strike again at any moment.
He says to Inspector Godley, "Congratulations, you have caught Jack the Ripper at last."
Yet even with their determination, the detectives were limited by the investigative tools of the time. Fingerprints had not yet been introduced. Chemical analysis was basic and unreliable, and photography could only capture posed images rather than the chaos of the crime scene. Detectives had to depend almost entirely on witness recollections and their own careful observation. Both of these were often flawed. People misremembered details, ignored what they had seen, or were too afraid to speak at all. Medical experts became a critical part of the investigation. Doctors such as George Bagster Phillips and Thomas Bond examined the victims closely, searching for patterns in the knife wounds and mutilations that might reveal the killer's methods or his mind.
All of these wounds had been inflicted by a knife, used violently and downwards.
Dr. Bond went further when he produced an early psychological profile in November 1888. He described the murderer as a man of solitary habits, subject to periodic attacks of homicidal and erotic mania. This early attempt to understand the criminal's personality and behavior is now seen as one of the first examples of offender profiling. Despite countless searches, interrogations, and arrests, the police were unable to bring the killer to justice.
Yet has never been identified by name, except by his moniker, Jack the Ripper.
When Mary Jane Kelly, the final canonical victim, was found murdered on the 9th of November 1888,
Mary Jane Kelly, also known as Marie Jeanette Kelly, was the final canonical victim of Jack the Ripper.
the killings stopped as suddenly and mysteriously as they had begun. The city was left with no answers. The killer might have died, been imprisoned for another crime, or simply disappeared into the crowd. No one knew for certain. This lack of closure ensured that speculation would continue long after the original detectives had retired, turning the case into a historical puzzle for future generations. Decades of theories and enduring mystery.
Jack the Ripper, the mysterious serial killer whose identity has long remained a mystery.
That is.
Until now.
Even after the official investigation into the Whitechapel murders fizzled out without any answers, people could not stop obsessing over Jack the Ripper.
But now it's the start of a trail that leads straight to the forgotten prime suspect in the Whitechapel murders of 1888.
The idea of a mysterious killer sneaking through foggy London streets, striking fear into the hearts of anyone unlucky enough to cross him, was impossible to ignore. Some were terrified. Others were just annoyed that the police seemed utterly clueless.
Is the long-lost identity of Jack the Ripper buried somewhere in it? And how was he able to elude us for more than 130 years?
Everyone wanted to know who this shadowy figure was, and everyone had an opinion. In 1894, 6 years after the last known murder, Assistant Commissioner Sir Melville Macnaghten wrote a confidential memorandum for the police. In it, he fingered 3 men as the most likely suspects. First was Montague John Druitt, a barrister who died right after the murders stopped. Some people thought the timing was suspicious enough to make him a prime candidate. Then there was Michael Ostrog, a career criminal with a fondness for violence, but not much evidence tying him to these particular murders. Finally, there was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-born barber with serious mental health issues. Each of these men had traits that could make them capable of such horrific acts, but none could be proven guilty. It was like trying to solve a murder puzzle with half the pieces missing. Even McNaughton admitted that his list was based more on rumor than on concrete evidence, a reflection of just how desperate the police were to name someone before public outrage consumed them. As the years passed, fascination with Jack the Ripper only grew. By the 20th century, writers, journalists, and amateur sleuths were practically tripping over each other to add their own theories. Some imagined the killer was a skilled surgeon, noting the precision of the mutilations. Others pictured a butcher, a slaughterman, or a deranged midwife who knew the alleys of Whitechapel too well. Some even suggested he was a foreign laborer, an outsider blamed for the sins of a city in chaos. Each theory said as much about the people imagining it as it did about the actual murderer. The obsession revealed more than curiosity. It exposed Victorian London's hidden tensions, its fear of the poor, its anxiety about immigration, and its uneasy relationship with mental illness. By the 1970s, scholars and amateur detectives began spending hours poring over dusty police reports, witness statements, and yellowed newspaper clippings, hoping to find a clue that everyone else had missed. During this period, a controversial new theory emerged when author Stephen Knight published Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, claiming the murders were part of a royal cover-up involving Freemasons and a secret heir to the throne. Around the same time, letters supposedly written by the killer were re-examined using forensic linguistics, and new photographic evidence from the Metropolitan Police Archive surfaced, showing crime scenes in greater detail than ever before. Even with these breakthroughs, no one ever came up with a definitive answer. Every new piece of evidence seemed to spawn more questions. Each generation interpreted the mystery in its own way, guided by contemporary fears, cultural biases, and sometimes just wild imagination. And as forensic science advanced in the late 20th century, researchers hoped that new technology could finally answer questions that intuition, deduction, and old-fashioned legwork had failed to solve. Modern forensics and the Walter Sickert hypothesis. The rise of DNA analysis and modern forensic methods during the 1990s sparked a renewed fascination with the Jack the Ripper's mystery. For the first time, researchers had tools that could potentially examine evidence left behind more than a century earlier. One of the most widely publicized modern theories came from the crime novelist Patricia Cornwell.
It's no mystery. She's the most popular crime novelist of the century. Patricia Cornwell's name emblazoned across the covers.
In 2002, she published a book titled Portrait of a Killer, Jack the Ripper Case Closed, in which she claimed that the famed painter Walter Sickert was the murderer. Cornwell built her argument around several key points. She highlighted Sickert's artwork, which frequently depicted violent and disturbing scenes, suggesting that he may have been obsessed with the type of brutality seen in the Ripper murders. She also focused on what she saw as his unusual interest in human anatomy, arguing that it could explain the way the victims were mutilated. Additionally, she claimed that the handwriting in some of Sickert's letters bore similarities to the infamous letters attributed to Jack the Ripper.
Now, as far as the paper is concerned, there's no doubt that it's paper from the correct period. It's got the right watermark in it, it's the right size.
To support her theory, Cornwell went beyond speculation. She invested in modern forensic testing, including mitochondrial DNA comparisons. Scientists examined letters believed to have been written by the Ripper and compared them to samples taken from Sickert's own correspondence. The hope was that scientific evidence could finally link a suspect to the crimes in a definitive way. Despite her efforts, most experts in the field were unconvinced. The authenticity of the letters tested was uncertain, and the genetic comparisons produced results that were far from conclusive. Even so, Cornwell's research captured worldwide attention and showed that forensic science could be used to revisit historical cases. Her work inspired new interest in the murders and encouraged later investigators to examine surviving artifacts more carefully and with greater scientific caution. One such artifact, a shawl reportedly recovered from one of the Ripper's crime scenes, would become central to the next and most significant line of investigation: the DNA study and the Kosminski connection. In 2014, British businessman Russell Edwards stumbled across something that shocked him.
He was a Polish immigrant Jew that came over to Whitechapel in 1881 with his brother.
He discovered an old, tattered shawl at a London auction, said to have been found beside Catherine Eddowes, one of Jack the Ripper's victims in Mitre Square. Its past was a complete mystery. Nobody knew who had owned it or how it had survived for more than 100 years. Some people whispered that it might have passed through countless hands, while others worried it was hopelessly contaminated. But for Edwards, the idea that this fragile piece of fabric might hold a clue about one of history's most infamous killers was electrifying. He could hardly sleep thinking about it. Edwards turned to science for answers. He hired 2 molecular biologists, Dr. Jari Luulainen and Dr. David Miller, to examine the shawl for traces of biological material. They used mitochondrial DNA, a type of genetic material passed down from mothers to children. This kind of DNA could suggest family connections, but could not identify a single person for certain. When the results came in, they stunned everyone. The DNA appeared to match descendants of Catherine Eddowes. Even more astonishing, it matched descendants of a woman who was the sister of Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski had been named as a suspect in the Ripper case over a century earlier. Suddenly, the mystery was no longer abstract. It had a living link to one of the most infamous names in the file. Born in Poland around 1865, Aaron Kosminski moved to London in the early 1880s with his family. They were part of a wave of Jewish immigrants who had fled persecution and poverty in Eastern Europe, hoping to rebuild their lives in safety. Instead, they found themselves in the brutal streets of Whitechapel, a place filled with disease, crime, and desperate poverty. Aaron worked as a barber, cutting hair for a few pennies while living in overcrowded lodgings surrounded by misery. Those who knew him described him as quiet but odd. Police and asylum records show that he suffered from delusions, heard voices, and displayed violent paranoia. Over time, he began to fear everyone around him. He refused food prepared by others because he believed it was poisoned. He wandered the streets at night, muttering to himself, sometimes following women and whispering things no one could quite understand. Some later speculated that his violence toward women may have grown from his fear and confusion, a warped response to the world that terrified him. He did not appear to hate women personally. Instead, he seemed consumed by inner chaos, lashing out at the most vulnerable people around him. By 1891, his family could no longer control him. He was admitted to Colney Hatch Asylum, where his mind deteriorated further. Witnesses said he sat for hours staring into nothing, sometimes rocking back and forth and mumbling about voices that ordered him to act. Attendants recalled that in his final years he was frail and detached from reality, no longer aware of who he was or what he had done. When he died in 1919, few took notice. His body was buried quietly, his name forgotten by the city he once terrorized. The rediscovery of the shawl changed that. When scientists linked its DNA to Kosminski's family, the past came roaring back,
which correlated the fact that mitochondrial DNA did indeed match both descendants of Eddowes and Kosminski.
People wept as they watched documentaries showing the results. Some felt an eerie sense of closure. Others were horrified to think that an unassuming immigrant barber could have been the most infamous killer in British history. For the descendants of the victims, the findings reopened wounds that had never fully healed. They imagined the fear their ancestors must have felt, and wondered whether the police could have stopped him sooner. By 2025, a broad scholarly consensus had begun to form around Aaron Kosminski as the most plausible perpetrator of the Whitechapel murders.
His name is Aaron Kosminski. He lived with his family just literally not far from the murders.
Decades of forensic research, psychological profiling, and historical cross-checking pointed to him with chilling consistency. Chief Inspector Swanson's handwritten notes, discovered in the margins of an old report, confirmed that a witness had identified Kosminski at the time but had refused to testify, leaving the case to rot in silence. His confinement in 1891 occurred at the exact time the murders stopped. That timing stood out in every police report and modern study as powerful evidence linking him to the crimes.
We did the research with all the top places in England, Sotheby's, the V&A.
After nearly a century and a half, the case that once paralyzed London with fear appeared to have found its ending. When the news broke, it was not met with celebration, but with quiet disbelief. Historians, criminologists, and the public felt a strange mixture of shock, relief, and sorrow. The revelation did not erase the horror or the suffering, but it brought a measure of understanding. The world finally had a name, a face, and a life story behind the shadow that haunted Whitechapel. It was both haunting and deeply human, to realize that Jack the Ripper was not a phantom or a myth, but a real man lost inside his own madness.
Jack the Ripper, the mysterious serial killer whose identity has long remained a mystery.
If you could ask Aaron Kosminski one question, what would it be? Comment down below.